I'd like to introduce our guest tonight. Dr. Symonds is one of the country's leading naval historians and the author of 12 books and numerous publications. His most recent book is entitled World War II at Sea, A Global History, which is a comprehensive study of naval activities on all the world's oceans and seas from 1939 to 1945. That's a huge area. And earlier I had mentioned to Dr. Symonds he was going to be talking, asking if he was going to be talking on his book, and he said, "Well, I don't think I can do that in 1 hour." So he's going to be speaking tonight on one specific topic, the Battle of the Atlantic. And I had the pleasure of hearing Dr. Symonds a couple of years ago at Gettysburg at the D-Day Symposium. And as I told Dr. Symonds, it was one of the fastest 1 hour talks I've ever experienced. So I think you're in for a treat tonight. So with that, allow me to present Dr. Craig Symonds.
Thank you, Terry. I appreciate that very much. And by the way, I appreciate also you are all pretending to have trouble with the technology, because I know you only did that to make me feel better, because I always have trouble with technology. So I appreciate your effort to make me feel more at home by demonstrating that technological problems are virtually universal. And of course, we're all virtual tonight anyway. I want to thank Chris Husband for inviting me to the talk, Bob Watkins, who helped me walk through some of the technology that I'm going to be dealing with here in the next few minutes. And of course, I want to thank all of you who signed up for this and then actually logged in. Maybe the next time we get together, it won't have to be virtual. Now, Terry, I appreciate your introduction, and some of you have looked over my bio and noted that my most recent book is in fact World War II at Sea. Let me see if I can share my desktop with you. Here's my topic tonight, and here's my plug for my most recent book. It was kind of fun. I got in the mail this week the Spanish, French, and Polish editions of this. So unless you read Polish, this is probably the one you want.
They gave me something to.
All right. I'm going to have to find a way to modify the size of this.
Oh, I'm in. Do you want me to?
Yeah, I need to get to my screen, Bob. Can you minimize this in some way? You know what I'm talking about? I need to make this smaller. Help me out, Bob. What can I do? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right.
I'm trying to figure out what I can do to help you.
Well, I did it just a minute ago.
Try the escape key.
There it is. But now you can't see it now, right?
Well, we can see your presentation. We can see your entire desktop.
All right.
The presentation,
We'll
we can
way,
see
then.
the PowerPoint presentation, but it's not in slide view.
Well, I'm just going to soldier on, and we'll figure this out as we go. Here's the book I was plugging. It's a big fat book, a real doorstop, I'm afraid. Covers the whole war, as Terry mentioned, all oceans, all participants for all 5 years. As we were joking earlier, Bob mentioned I'm not going to try to do all of this tonight. I promise, not in 45 minutes or so. So I'm going to focus on the Battle of the Atlantic, which was a central component of the global war. In fact, the term itself is a bit of a misnomer because it implies that it was a single event, literally a battle. And of course, it should more properly be called a campaign because it was a relentless struggle that began on literally the first day of the war and continued virtually nonstop for more than 4 years. In the process of that, however, it passed through several very distinctive phases marked by shifting geographical boundaries and technological innovations. And I'm going to try to organize my remarks around those 4 phases. So, phase 1. This was the confrontation between British convoys and German U-boats from September of 1939 to the summer of 1940. Now, Britain, of course, is an island nation and absolutely dependent on trade. It literally could not feed itself. It had to import 80% of all its grain, almost all of its oil. And aware that Germany would almost certainly seek to cut off those imports, the British Admiralty established a convoy system even before declaring war. You getting this image, Bob?
Yes, we are.
Okay. At least in one way, relying on convoys seems counterintuitive, and a lot of people argued against it, particularly in the First World War. For one thing, of course, it groups all the ships into what a U-boat skipper might call a target-rich environment, as you see in this slide. For another, the whole convoy, often consisting of 60, 70, even 80 ships, necessarily had to proceed at the speed of the slowest ship. Most convoys, therefore, traveled between 7 to 9 knots, not exactly lightning speed. And of course, that prolonged the period of their vulnerability. The slower you go, the longer you spend at sea, the more likely you are to be found and attacked by German U-boats. This was precisely why the British had been reluctant to adopt convoys during the First World War. But when they did in 1917, experience proved that it was by far the most effective trade defense strategy. So that for the Second World War in 1939, the British created a global convoy system from the very start, even before the war actually began. Now, to attack these convoys, the Germans employed what in German they call the Unterseeboot, or U-boat. And why am I not getting this to move? Come on. This is not helping. There it is. This is the Type 7 U-boat. The Type 7C was the most common version of German U-boats used in the Second World War. It's pretty small, 750 tons displacement. That's tiny, by the way. 750 tons sounds like a lot, but it's not. It could make about 17 knots on the surface. You see that it's shaped actually like a surface craft with that sharp bow and a flat deck. But it could make only about 5 knots submerged because it's really fundamentally a surface ship that can go underwater for a brief period of time. Now, as you all know, the Germans tried U-boat warfare in the First War too, and it had not worked, or at least it had not worked to the point of allowing them to win the war. But the technology of submarines changed a lot between 1919 and 1939. U-boats of the First War had a range of only a few hundred miles, which meant they could operate only in waters close to Britain. Here we go. Essentially in the shaded area you see here. Even with such a limited hunting range, though, the U-boats had come close to breaking the British economy, so that the authors of the Versailles Treaty included a clause that made it illegal for Germany to have any U-boats at all. And for 16 years, it didn't. Then in 1935, note the date, 1935, this is 2 years after Hitler seizes power, but 4 years before the war begins. In 1935, Britain agreed to a treaty with Hitler's regime that allowed Germany to build as many submarines as the British had, which at that time was 57. Why did they do this? Well, one reason was that in 1935, the British were worried about a reviving Soviet Union, and they hoped that a strengthened Germany would be a buffer against Soviet ambitions. But in addition to that, they believed they had developed a secret weapon that virtually neutralized the threat of the U-boat. It was called Asdic. You see a couple of, these happen to be Canadian sailors, as you can see by the patch on their arm, a couple of sailors working in Asdic system. It's an acronym for Admiralty Sound Detection Investigating Committee, ASDIC, ASDIC. And that was the group that designed and built it. It was a sound ranging system, essentially what Americans would later call sonar, but the British were a bit ahead of the Americans in this technology, and understandably so. With it, British escort ships could now find and track a submerged U-boat while it was still underwater. Well, problem solved. We don't have to worry about U-boats anymore. Here perhaps is a cautionary tale about assuming that a technological breakthrough will solve a strategic difficulty. It can help, but not by itself. What the British did not count on was that the new generation of German U-boats did not attack underwater. They attacked on the surface at night. And ASDIC was useless against surfaced U-boats. So that in this first phase of the war, remember, neither side had radar, so the surfaced U-boats remained invisible. The new German U-boats were also technologically more advanced. They now had a range of up to 7,000 miles, which meant that they could hunt well out into the Atlantic, well beyond that danger zone we saw in the earlier map, right around the British Isles. Indeed, because of that, the German U-boats might well have succeeded in starving Britain into submission in the first year of the war if they had had enough U-boats, but they didn't. And here's why. This cheerful looking fellow is Carl Dönitz, probably not a guy you'd want to sit down to have a beer with. Dönitz had been an enthusiastic champion of U-boats ever since his service in the First World War as a mere lieutenant. All through the 20 years of the interwar period when Germany had no U-boats at all, he stayed in the German Navy, serving on destroyers and cruisers. But as soon as the Anglo-German Treaty was signed in 1935, he went back into submarines. And from that moment until the end of the war, 10 years later, he was the head of the German U-boat arm. Now, the 1935 treaty with Britain allowed Germany to build as many boats as Britain had, which was, as I mentioned, 57. So that was the number Dönitz had when the war began. Not very many. And even that number is misleading. Half of those 57 were small coastal defensive boats that could not make the run out into the open Atlantic. The Germans built 28 more between 1939 and 1940, but they also lost 28 boats in that same period. So Dönitz had to make do with his 30-something ocean-going U-boats. Now, Dönitz had told Hitler that he needed 300 U-boats to cut off British trade, and that would starve the island into submission, and in fact might well have done so. Hitler told him he would have plenty of time to accumulate that number because Hitler did not plan to start a war until 1945. But Hitler, being Hitler, was impatient and went to war in 1939. And as a result, Dönitz had to make do with the few U-boats that he had. And even with those, they had to make a long trip all the way around the north of Scotland before they got to the good hunting grounds in the mid-Atlantic. And that meant, because he had boats going out and boats going back and boats under repair, that at any given time, he only had about 10 on active patrol. But even with so few, Dunitz showed what might have been possible if he had had the 300 that he wanted. His U-boat sank 165 Allied ships in the first 4 months of the war, and 166 more in the first 6 months of 1940. Now that was serious, but not quite enough to be strategically decisive. Then came phase 2. In June of 1940, France fell to the German Blitzkrieg. That was a huge shock to the whole world. It not only isolated Britain in the war, it also gave Dunitz access to new U-boat bases along the coast of France. Here at these red dots on the Bay of Biscay, that was where the German U-boat pens were now located. So that instead of going all the way around the north of Scotland to get to the open Atlantic, they could get there quicker and stay there longer. And Dunitz also began to get more boats, not the 300 he wanted, but more than the 50 he started with. So as a result, in the second 6 months of 1940, his U-boat sank 331 ships, twice the number as the previous 6 months. And at that rate of loss, Britain would starve. Just as the British coordinated their convoys from an office in Whitehall called Trade Plot, Dunitz coordinated his boats from a central facility on the French coast near Saint-Nazaire called Carnival. You can see Saint-Nazaire kind of in the middle of this map. And here's how that system worked. The U-boats would be deployed individually, but when one of them spotted a British convoy, instead of attacking it right away, it alerted Dunitz at Carnival by radio. Then Dunitz would radio other U-boats in the area and send them to the scene so that all of the U-boats could attack at once. These, of course, were the famous wolf packs. In these circumstances, the targeted convoy might lose not 1 or maybe 2 ships, but 10 or 20. In October of 1940, for example, one convoy lost 20 out of 35 ships in a single night. And in fact, the convoy might have been wiped out altogether if the U-boats had not run out of torpedoes. The U-boat skippers called this die Glücklichzeit, or the happy time. One reason for this slaughter was that the British simply did not have enough escort vessels to protect their convoys. The British had lost a score of destroyers in the campaign for Norway and almost a dozen in the evacuation of Dunkirk. And consequently, most of the convoys had to be guarded by only one ship. And because of that, Churchill all but begged Roosevelt in the still neutral United States to share with the British some of the hundreds of World War I era destroyers that were rusting away along the Atlantic coast. This put Roosevelt in a tough spot. FDR sincerely believed that America's own national security depended on Britain's survival, and he probably would have been willing to give the ships to Churchill. They were outdated, obsolete. The United States was not using them. But the American public, and in particular the American Congress, was suspicious of getting involved in yet another European war. Suspicious Republicans would not part with the ships, obsolete though they might be, without some clear quid pro quo. So FDR worked out a deal. The British got 50 of these old American destroyers, about as many as you see in this photograph, in exchange for 99-year leases on a dozen British bases in the Western Hemisphere, most of them in the Caribbean. The British House of Commons balked at that. They thought it was a pretty stiff price to pay for a few outmoded ships, but Churchill was grateful, telling Roosevelt that the ships were worth their weight in rubies. Roosevelt might have gone even further. He authorized what he called neutrality patrols, essentially ordering the US Navy to act in ways that were clearly not neutral in support of those British convoys. At first, they merely provided the British with information about any U-boats they spotted. But over time, they became more active until they were serving almost as virtual escorts for British convoys. That led to a number of confrontations with German U-boats in the fall of 1941. The fall of 1941, that's still before Pearl Harbor. Inevitably, shots were fired, depth charges dropped, torpedoes launched, and in his fireside chats, Roosevelt insisted that these were deliberate attacks on US ships by German U-boats that he called rattlesnakes. And when a rattlesnake strikes, he said, you don't wait to ask its politics before you destroy it. As 1941 came to an end, it was clearly evident that Dönitz was winning the Battle of the Atlantic, and Germany was winning the war. Then it all changed. Which brings us to phase 3. That began effectively when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. You see here the Arizona in flames and smoke, and brought the United States fully into the war. That was in the Pacific, of course, but the impact was global. After waiting a day or two, Hitler declared war on the United States, and he unleashed Dönitz to carry his U-boat war to the American East Coast. The war on trade also extended into the Arctic, where Allied supply convoys were carrying Lend-Lease goods from the United States to the Soviet Union around the North Cape of Norway. In short, the Battle of the Atlantic morphed into a worldwide war against Allied trade wherever it might be. Dönitz called his U-boat offensive against American trade along the US East Coast Operation Paukenschlag. You like that? Paukenschlag, it's my German. That translates roughly to drum roll or drum beat. He wanted to send a dozen of his long-range Type 9 U-boats, bigger than the Type 7s, to the American coast, but the high command authorized him to send only half that many. And one of those developed an oil leak, so in the end, he sent only 5. That was not enough to be strategically decisive. And once again, we have to wonder how history would have been different if he had had more U-boats. Because even with those 5, it provoked a near panic in the United States. The Americans left their peacetime lights on, and there were easy pickings for the U-boats, especially in oil tankers, one of which we see going up in flames here. In January of 1942, the first year of American involvement in the war, 95% of all the crude oil pumped from the oil fields of Louisiana and East Texas made its way to the eastern seaboard in tankers that rounded Cape Hatteras off North Carolina. Now, eventually, the U.S. shifted much of that oil to pipelines, railroads, but in 1942, it all went by sea. And in the first 2 weeks of January 1942, the 5 U-boats of Operation Drumbeat sank 41 U.S. tankers, displacing 236,000 tons. The American reaction to this onslaught was, and frankly still is, somewhat controversial. And the man at the center of that controversy was this guy, Admiral Ernest J. King, who was both Chief of Naval Operations and Commander-in-Chief of the US Navy. Now, I have to be a little careful here, since I just spent 3 years as the Ernest J. King Professor at the Naval War College, but it is a simple fact that King refused to establish coastal convoys for these ships. His explanation was that he lacked the escorts needed to protect them, and that gathering the tankers and the other ships into convoys without escorts simply bunched them up for the U-boats. The British disagreed. They insisted that their experience proved that convoys, even traveling without escorts, fared better than ships traveling alone. The problem here is it's hard to prove that, because while it might be true in the open ocean where a ship was like a needle in a haystack, it might be less true along the east coast of the United States, where the convoys moved in a pretty predictable course around Cape Hatteras. In any case, the slaughter along the American East Coast continued from January of 1942 into the spring of 1943. In fact, in April alone, the U-boats off the US coast sank 133 ships, boosting global Allied shipping losses to over 800,000 tons in 1 month. At that rate, the Allies would lose the war. King did finally establish a convoy system around Cape Hatteras in May, using mostly US Coast Guard cutters and British coal-burning armed trawlers, another obsolete type, but any ship in a storm. And after that, the U-boats moved further south to the Florida coast and into the Caribbean. Meanwhile, a third front in the Battle of the Atlantic opened up from Iceland to Russian ports in the Barents Sea. You see the route here. The Red Army, after all, was bearing the brunt of the land war against Hitler's divisions, tying down some 200 German divisions. Now, to gain some perspective on that, in the entire war, from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, the United States organized a total worldwide in all theaters of 90 divisions. The Russians faced more than twice that by themselves every day, though some of the German divisions were at less than full strength. Still, it was obviously in American and British interest to keep the Russians fighting, to tie down those Germans' divisions, and that meant keeping the Russians fed and supplied. To deliver the food and supplies, however, meant navigating the Arctic Sea, where the weather was even worse than in the North Atlantic. These convoys were neither as large nor as regular as the ones to Britain, and Stalin complained about that all the time. From first to last, the inherently paranoid Stalin suspected that the Americans and the British were supplying him with just enough equipment, just enough ammunition to keep killing Germans, while the Anglo-Americans waited around for the Germans and the Russians to kill each other off. He was not entirely wrong, at least as far as Churchill was concerned. I mean, after all, Nazis were killing communists, and communists were killing Nazis. Why would you want to interfere with that? Service on the North Cape convoys was extraordinarily tough duty and dangerous as well. The classic example is a convoy known as PQ-17. Each convoy had a designator that allowed it to be identified individually. PQ-17 sailed from Iceland in July 1942 using that northern route, the summer route that you see on this map. By now, Allied escorts were more plentiful, and this convoy of 34 merchant ships had a very large escort of 6 destroyers, 4 corvettes, and 2 cruisers, plus some smaller craft. And as it plodded eastward, British code breakers intercepted and broke a German radio message that suggested the battleship Tirpitz and 2 pocket battleships were getting underway from their ports in northern Norway. Now, as it happened, they actually did not. But before anyone realized that, orders went out from Whitehall for the escorts to withdraw, to pull back, essentially to abandon the convoy, and for the merchant ships to scatter. It was a death sentence. A German force did sortie, you see that blue line at the bottom, but it returned to port almost immediately. But with the merchant ships now scattered over the Barents Sea, they became easy pickings for the U-boats and for German aircraft operating from Norwegian bases. 23 ships went to the bottom, taking with them 430 tanks, 3,500 trucks and jeeps, 210 bombers, and 100,000 tons of ammunition. And even worse than that, at least from the Russian point of view, the disaster caused the Allies to stop the North Cape convoys for the rest of the summer. That, of course, put even more strain on already tenuous relations between Stalin and the Western Allies. Now, I mentioned the code breakers. This is an aspect of the Battle of the Atlantic that has gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of decades, mainly because prior to that, the role of the code breakers, indeed their very existence, was secret. Some of you may have seen the movie The Imitation Game, in which Benedict Cumberbatch and a few other nonconformist geniuses built a computer that broke the German code and won the war. Well, there's actually some truth in that, though as usual, the story is a bit more complicated than the one presented by Hollywood. Let me start at the beginning. Donitz's Wolfpack tactics necessarily required the use of wireless radio to coordinate the U-boat attacks. To encode those messages, the Germans used a machine. It was called the Enigma Machine. And as you can see, it looked something like a typewriter. The operator input the messages simply by typing them on a keyboard, but when he did, the letters were changed because the electrical impulse passed through those 3 rotating wheels you can see just above the keyboard. The wheels rotated 1 click after each keystroke, so that before the message was actually transmitted, the original letter that was typed in was modified, get ready for this, 160 quintillion times. If you're taking notes and want to write that down, that's 160 followed by 18 more zeros. And given that, the Germans were pretty confident in the security of their radio messages. And yet, the British did eventually break through this code, first by building on the work done by a Polish mathematician, which the Poles supplied to the British, and then second by capturing an intact Enigma machine from a sinking U-boat. Only after that did the geniuses at Bletchley Park, north of London, build an electromagnetic computer that began to break through the layers of secrecy layer by layer and bit by bit until the British could read pieces of the message, not all of them and not immediately. At first it took several days, by which time generally the information was too old to matter. But over time, they got better at it. And eventually they managed to get a bit of useful intelligence. It was so secret, they developed an entirely new classification for it above top secret. It was called Ultra. When the codebreakers found something promising, they forwarded it to the Operational Intelligence Center at Admiralty House in London, which was presided over by a reserve Royal Navy commander named Roger Wynne, this unlikely looking character here. Wynne still remains largely unknown to most students of the war. He was a lawyer in civilian life with a knack for languages. When the war broke out, he volunteered his services to the government, despite the fact that he was a paraplegic. Like FDR, he had been crippled by polio. But he proved so valuable that the Royal Navy gave him a direct commission as a Royal Navy commander and put him in charge of trade plot. When Wynne got an ultra intercept from Bletchley Park revealing where Dönitz was sending his U-boats, he then sent out his own wireless message to the nearest convoy, diverting it to a new route. The great value of ultra intelligence was that it allowed convoys to be routed away from known U-boat congregations. What Wynne did not know was that the Germans were also breaking his messages. Back in 1940, a German surface raider captured the steamer Automedon in the Indian Ocean and seized her confidential files, including the maritime codes, before they could be destroyed. This meant that throughout the Battle of the Atlantic, the Germans were decoding British messages to help them find the convoys. At the same time, the British were decoding German messages to avoid them. In the clandestine code-breaking race that lasted really throughout the war, the British proved slightly more efficient at this, and the number of sinkings declined. There was a glitch in February 1942 when the Germans added a fourth wheel to that Enigma machine, and all of a sudden the code breakers at Bletchley could no longer read the messages. As a result, the convoys more frequently blundered into wolf packs. Sinkings jumped again from 370,000 tons a month back up to 500,000 tons. You can see here the big jump in lost Allied ships in 1942. The Germans called this the second happy time. The fourth phase in the Battle of the Atlantic began as 1942 drew to a close. The turning point in the battle was the spring of 1943, and there were three reasons for this. First, more Allied escorts became available, and they carried newer and better anti-submarine weapons, and they got air support. Among the new escorts was a class of ship called, well, what else? A destroyer escort. They were smaller than full-size destroyers, slightly bigger than a corvette, about 1,200 tons displacement, and not very comfortable to ride in the North Atlantic. Note the open bridge. You don't sit inside a closed bridge to give orders. You stand out there in the elements to do it. But they were perfectly satisfactory for trade defense. The United States built more than 500 of these during the war, which meant that the convoys now had substantially more protection. Moreover, many of these new ships carried a new weapon, a forward-throwing weapon called a Hedgehog. It could fire 75-pound Torpex bomblets in an elliptical pattern out ahead of the ship. Previously, a destroyer or a destroyer escort had to pass over the top of a submerged U-boat and then roll depth charges off the stern. Now, with the Hedgehog, the escorts could assume an offensive role. The name, by the way, Hedgehog, comes from the fact that after all the charges were fired, the spiky appearance of the launch unit resembled, at least to the British, a hedgehog. One problem all convoys up to now had suffered was the lack of air cover. If you've seen the new Tom Hanks movie, Greyhound, which I can recommend, you might recall the airplane from the United States heading back to the US and wishing him good luck as he set out, and then being met again by another airplane from Britain. And in between was a kind of black hole where they had no air cover. Then in 1943, they deployed the first Escort carrier. It was the USS Bogue, which is the ship you see here. It was built on top of a freighter hull. It had no hangar deck, carried only about half a dozen airplanes, but she and her subsequent sister ships now gave the convoys eyes in the air all the way across the Atlantic. Of all these innovations, however, the most important one that ensured Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was radar. Now, radar had existed before the war, but until 1942, only the largest warships would have it, a battleship, a carrier. By 1943, however, virtually all Allied ships had radar, and even some of the airplanes. That meant the U-boats were no longer invisible at night. The impact of all these innovations was soon evident. In May of 1943, a critical turning point, by the way, Dunitz vectored no fewer than 43 U-boats, 43, against a single westbound convoy from Liverpool to Halifax. It was the largest aggregation of U-boats in the war. And on the second night of the attack, the convoy was enveloped by fog. The U-boats couldn't see, but thanks to radar, the escorts could. And instead of defending the convoy, the escorts were able to go on the attack. The hunted became the hunters. The escorts sank 6 U-boats that night and damaged 7 more. Not a single merchant ship was lost. Dunitz called off the attack, and he all but acknowledged that he had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. That May 1943 confrontation marked the decisive turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. Ships were still lost after that, of course, but the Germans could no longer hope that they could break the Atlantic sea lanes. In fact, however, I'm going to argue here that Dunitz had lost the battle well before May of 1943 due to an entirely different factor. In 1940, Dunitz told Hitler, "The submarine war will be a failure if we do not sink more ships than the enemy is able to build." And that, in the end, proved to be the key. By mid-1943, the economic industrial powerhouse that was the United States was able to build new ships faster than the Germans could sink them. It's not too much to argue that what won the Second World War was American money and industrial productivity. The key was standardization. Instead of building ships one at a time like a skyscraper, they were mass produced the way Henry Ford built cars. Component parts were built to specs at scores of factories all around the country. They were shipped by railroad to the building ways on both coasts, along the Gulf of Mexico, even on America's inland rivers. And there they were assembled, not with rivets as they were before the war, but with welds, by workers working in 3 shifts, quite literally around the clock. Excuse me. American shipyards like this one hummed with activity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The welding machines were never even turned off. They were just passed from hand to hand. And the results were unprecedented. An example. In January 1942, the first year of American involvement in the war, producing a 10,000-ton Liberty ship from keel to launch took 250 days. By December of that same year, it took 50 days. The Oregon Shipbuilding Company in Portland, which is the one, by the way, seen in this photograph, produced one in 17 days. That inspired the workers at Kaiser's Richmond Yard on San Francisco Bay to build one in precisely 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. Now that was a publicity stunt, of course, but many yards proved able to build a ship from keel to launch in less than 30 days and do it over and over again. And all the while, the United States was also producing scores of aircraft carriers, cruisers, escorts, and tens of thousands of combat aircraft. It was a national accomplishment at least as important to victory as the Battle of Midway or D-Day. Let me illustrate this with a few kind of interesting photographs. Here in this photograph, we see a ship under construction at the Bethlehem Fairfield Shipyard in Baltimore in April of 1943. The men are setting up wooden framing for the keel of the ship that's about to be laid. You might want to take a look at the headgear they're wearing. I'm not sure what OSHA would make of wearing a fedora instead of a hard hat, but here we are. And here are some other images of that same vessel on day 2, on day 6, on day 10, on day 14, on day 24, and there she goes, 25 days. And the next day, a frame would be laid in this slip for the next ship. In December of 1942, the production of new ships surpassed 1 million tons in a month for the first time, and it went up from there. Now, no matter how many U-boats Dunitz had or how many ships they managed to sink, they would never get ahead of American productivity. Now, that doesn't mean that we should overlook the pain and the suffering of the men who made up the crews on those ships, far too many of whom were doomed to drift about the frigid North Atlantic on tiny rafts or lifeboats until they were rescued, or far too often died of thirst, starvation, or exposure. Still, in a cold-blooded calculation, as long as American shipyards could produce ships faster than the U-boats could sink them, Germany could never win the Battle of the Atlantic. Here is a chart that shows this in a visceral way. The dark gray area below the center line shows the monthly destruction of Allied shipping by U-boats. The numbers are huge in 1942. Then they declined significantly in 1943 after the addition of escort destroyers, carriers, and radar. The light gray shaded area on top, which is a little harder to see in this slide, shows the construction of new ships, and the solid dark line shows the net loss or gain. And as you can see, new construction began to outpace losses at the end of 1942, and by the end of 1943, the US was building 6 times as many ships per month as the Germans could sink. Here's where the Battle of the Atlantic was won. So to sum up, how did the Allies win the Battle of the Atlantic? First, by perseverance. The British, with their backs to the wall, hung on long enough until the Russians, with their manpower, and then the Americans, with their industrial capacity, joined the war. Second, by technological innovations, many of them made on the fly in the middle of the war. Not only more and better and different kinds of escort ships, but also escort carriers by the Hedgehog, and especially by radar. Third, by breaking the Enigma code, which allowed the Allies to stay just far enough ahead of the German code breakers to maneuver the convoys around the wolf packs. And fourth, and finally, by simply outbuilding the Axis powers due to America's overwhelming industrial superiority. None of that should reduce our admiration for the men who fought the U-boats throughout those long and bitterly cold North Atlantic nights. They were essential too. and so were the merchant seamen on the freighters, the code breakers in their windowless rooms, and the thousands of shipyard workers who built the ships that carried the goods that allowed England to survive and allowed the Allies to invade Europe. Okay, that's my pitch, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. That was another quick 45 minutes or whatever. I have a couple of questions here. Actually, there are a bunch, Dr. Symonds. I assume you have a couple more minutes in your schedule to answer.
Sure.
Let's see if I can get, let me go to the top here. Let's see. To what extent did the Japanese and German leadership, as far as merchant and naval activity, conspire and cooperate before and during the war? So I guess we're looking for, was there any coordination between the Japanese and the Germans before?
Yeah, great question. The answer is not much. And I guess it shouldn't surprise you that there was not a lot of, let me put it this way. The British and the Americans were allies. The Germans and the Japanese were just on the same side. And because of that, the Germans and the Japanese simply did not coordinate. Oh, there were some efforts in that direction. There was some talk about coordinating in the Indian Ocean so that the Japanese naval forces could meet up with German forces and attack India and close off the Persian Gulf and so on. But it never really came to much. There was some effort of German commerce raiders refueling in British ports, in Japanese ports. That never really came to much either. So again, as I say, this is not a case of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. It's almost as if the whole was less than the sum of the parts, because the Japanese and the Germans, each of them obsessed with their own racial, cultural superiority, just didn't really think their partners had much to offer that was worth their paying attention to. So the answer is they did not coordinate much, certainly not nearly as much as the Anglo-Americans did in the war.
That, I guess we can be thankful, right?
Yeah, right. And that's a good thing.
I see there are a couple of movie questions, movie related, two different movies and sort of two questions. One is how accurately or how historically accurate was the movie Das Boot? Which
Das Boot is very good. What it really shows what life was like inside a German U-boat. If you saw the German language version with subtitles, I think it was even clearer. I mean, they were extraordinarily crowded. They were very tiny. I mentioned 750,000 tons displacement. When they moved from compartment to compartment, the crewmen had to crawl on their hands and knees. There were no showers. They used a bucket for toilets. I mean, it was a horrible experience. So they sacrificed enormously so that when in late 1942, early 1943, they didn't experience the same kinds of success, their morale plummeted rather dramatically. So Das Boot, I think, shows that, what life was like in those crowded, claustrophobic iron coffins, as one German U-boat skipper called them.
I saw that at the movie theater when it premiered, and I felt claustrophobic in a movie theater.
Yeah, that's right.
I can imagine. The other question pertains to a movie you mentioned very briefly, the Tom Hanks movie Greyhound. I haven't seen the movie, but what's your assessment of that movie?
Well, I have to recommend that you do see it. I have some friends who were picking apart various little aspects of it that I thought were unimportant, but I think overall it captures extraordinarily well the other side. If Das Boot shows what it was like to be in that iron coffin submerged under the sea, Greyhound shows what it was like to be in one of the escorting destroyers responsible for 30 or 40 merchant ships who had to be herded like sheep. It's actually based on a book called The Good Shepherd. So you get a sense of Tom Hanks kind of shepherding these ships across the ocean. And you also get the sense of his religious involvement. Full disclosure here, I have to confess that I worked with Tom Hanks on both the script and the movie. So I'm not an uninterested commentator, but I think it's excellent.
Well, that's good that they consulted you. I mean, that's promising start right there. I have a couple of questions really related to Bethlehem Steel, and I assume they mean Bethlehem in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. One person said they were told that Bethlehem Steel shipyards or no, this is shipyards, it could turn out a ship a day. Is there any truth to that? There's also somebody else asked the same question.
Yeah, there is, but it depends on how you count, of course, like all kinds of statistics, liars, damn liars, and statisticians, right? I mean, the way you make the argument that they turned out a ship a day is a lot of these shipyards had between 6 for a small shipyard and as many as 24 slipways, so that at any given time, there might be 20 or more ships under construction. So that if it took 28 days, 32 days to build a ship, but there are 24 slipways, yes, it's possible to conceive that out of that shipyard, one ship could be launched on average, one per day. Maybe not quite that fast, but very close to it. It doesn't mean they built the ship in a day. It would take, I mean, even that publicity stunt where they worked around the clock, full speed to do one in 4 days, 17 hours and 29 minutes, typically would be a month. Let's say a month for a Liberty ship. But if you've got 24 slipways, that means you're producing one out of that shipyard pretty much every day.
Okay, I have a question. Well, I got my glasses here. This is from my friend David Barrett, who had some difficulty joining us. David's our speaker in March. He has a question here. Is it true that by the end of the war, the hunters, and I assume he means U-boat, suffered the highest casualty rate, 75% of any service during the war?
Probably. It depends on the timing of this. You know, the 8th Air Force out of the air bases in East Anglia in Britain, at Schweinfurt and Remagen and some of the other really horrible air raids over Germany suffered loss rates as high as that. But if you're looking at the overall campaign for that period, I would imagine that in the spring of 1943, the death rate for those serving in German U-boats was as high or higher than in any other operational unit in the world. I think that's probably accurate. Now, that's not necessarily true for over the whole war. I don't have those numbers immediately to hand, and I don't want to disparage the losses of other units and other venues in short periods of time. For 3 days on Tarawa in November of 1943, the Marines suffered horribly. Iwo Jima the same way. The 8th Air Force I already mentioned. But yeah, I think being in a U-boat in the spring of 1943 was probably the single most dangerous place to be in the war.
Okay, here's a question. It's not, actually, it's not a question. It said someone should mention Dr. Symonds' great course lecture series on World War II and the Pacific Theater. So I will. I'll mention your course. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that was a lot of fun to do. I got a call out of the blue one day asking if I wanted to come down and try out a lecture. And of course, I knew about the great courses. It's a really good program. So I went down to Virginia, which is where they record these things. I did a trial lecture, and they decided this was going to work out. So I worked up a series of 24 lectures, and they're very interesting the way they do it now. It used to be that they would just stand you up in front of a fake crowd, and you would just hold forth at some point. They're very stylized now. You write up each lecture, 4,000 words, give or take 100, which lasts about 30 minutes. You present these lectures before a trio of cameras so they can get your good side and your bad side. And then they fill in with maps and clips and so forth. And I had an opportunity to design some maps for them as to what would work and what would not. All in all, I was very impressed with how conscientious they were in putting this together. And I'm kind of pleased with the way it came out. So if any of you want to take a look, by the way, I'll mention this. This is a little self-promotional too. It was like $369 if you bought the whole 24 lecture set. But I saw online last week, if you get the electronic version online, in other words, you just get the access code, the whole series is $25 now. So I don't even mean whether that, I don't know whether that means it's gone down in value or it's just a really good deal. But this might be a time to look into that.
Somebody wants to know how you got interested in naval warfare history.
Ah, it's C.S. Forester's fault. I began reading C.S. Forester novels, the Hornblower series, if you don't know them, when I was about 8 or 9. Read them over. I still reread them, not every year, but frequently. I think they're absolutely splendid literature, and they really give you a sense of naval combat in the age of sail. These are set in the Napoleonic Wars. Hornblower is a character in the book who we meet as a midshipman and rises up to become an admiral, and the various adventures he goes through. So I think that was probably my first toe through the crack of the door into naval history. I did naval history in graduate school, which is pretty hard to find, by the way. There aren't a lot of programs that do naval history. And then I was hired, where else, by the United States Naval Academy, where I taught for 30 years, teaching naval history to generations of young men and women who went on to become admirals and congressmen and governors and at least 2 secretaries of the Navy. And then I focused mostly in my research on the Civil War. I've recently turned more to the Second World War, World War II, which is what I work on now. But in both cases, it's kind of focused on naval history.
Great. A couple more questions here. What do you recommend for further reading on the Battle of the Atlantic? Your book first, of course, but besides yours.
On the Battle of the Atlantic. I should have been ready for this. I should have expected this call. I have a lot of my favorite authors on World War II naval activities in general, Jim Hornfisher, Rich Frank, Ian Toll, and others. But they mostly do Pacific stuff. For the Battle of the Atlantic, there's a fellow named Richard Snow, whose father served in the Battle of the Atlantic and wrote kind of a very breezy, if that's a word you can use to describe the Battle of the Atlantic, but a very readable, that's a better word, account of the Battle of the Atlantic that I would recommend. S-N-O-W, Richard Snow. I've forgotten the name of the book, but it'll pop if you look it up in Amazon.
I think that question probably comes up a lot. I was just attending a webinar yesterday that Penn State Harrisburg put on with an expert on the Holocaust, and that was one of the questions somebody asked her. What are your book recommendations for the Holocaust? So she was put on the spot too. You're not the only one.
Yeah.
I do have another question here. See if I can read it without my glasses. Do you have any figures on how many Americans, including merchant Marines, died in the Battle of the Atlantic?
I don't. That's a great question. I should have had that to hand. I should have expected the question, but I don't have that. I would have to look it up. My guess is you could probably go into Wikipedia and get that, but I don't have it off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
And I have one more question here about how well was the Italian submarine fleet integrated into the U-boat effort in the Atlantic?
A good question. The answer is not well and not effectively.
Not surprising.
Once again, the Italians and the Germans, although they cooperated more than the Germans and the Japanese did, they still did not cooperate well. The Germans never had the time of day for the Italians. They thought they wouldn't fight hard, their equipment was no good, and so on and so on. And the real problem the Italians had was that they had no access to fuel oil. The Germans were getting their fuel oil, both synthetic and of course from the Romanian oil fields, and they wouldn't share it with the Italians. So the Italians couldn't go to sea very often, which means they didn't get a lot of practice at sea time, which meant when they confronted the British Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, which was their principal combat theater for naval activity, were very much at a disadvantage. And then, of course, the Italian submarines were quite different. I mentioned that the German U-boats are very small, 750 tons, tiny. The Italian submarines were bigger. I don't want to say more luxurious, because that's not a word you use with submarines, but they were certainly more livable than the German U-boats. But partly perhaps because of that, they were a bit cumbersome. They did not have the same communications network as the Germans did, so that in the one time they tried to cooperate with the Germans in a wolf pack in the Bay of Biscay, they just couldn't get anything done. Now, they did have some spectacular successes, particularly in the Mediterranean. They sunk a carrier, they sunk a battleship. Italian frogmen were particularly bold and daring and destroyed a number of ships. But by and large, once again, there was very little coordination. And I guess I could make a philosophical comment here about when thieves get together to do evil things, they very seldom cooperate effectively. They're usually a gang running around, bumping into each other, getting in each other's way. Maybe we saw some of that last month in our own capital, but it does apply here. The Germans, Italians, and Japanese, the Axis powers, really were not a single unit. They were three governments that all happened to be fighting the same enemy, and that's just about all they had in common.
And I think if anybody takes for granted the cooperation between, especially the United States and Great Britain, they should read books by Eisenhower or FDR and just find out how difficult that really was, and Churchill.
I think it speaks really well to men like Eisenhower, and in the Pacific, frankly, Chester Nimitz, who recognized the fragility of alliances and worked really hard to make them work. Eisenhower was never in a battle. One of our greatest soldiers ever, never in a battle. But what Eisenhower had was that deft touch, that political sensibility to know exactly how to get the most out of his subordinates, how to get others to cooperate, how to get everyone to pull on the same rope. And that was critical.
I just finished Susan Eisenhower's book on her grandfather, How Ike Led, and she touches upon,
Yeah, Susan's a good friend. She
writes on that a lot. It's just excellent book. I have one more question, and this one's come up twice, and I would be guilty if I didn't read it. I'll just read it. It's from Denny's iPad, and I'll just read it. My father was a U.S. Navy armed guard. Would you please explain that for everyone? I assume that Denny means what exactly was a U.S. Navy armed guard? Are you familiar with that?
I'm
role?
not really particularly familiar with that. Now the Navy had, and still has for that matter, what generically are known as MPs, people who go on shore patrol to keep the sailors from killing each other or anybody else, and particularly killing Army soldiers who get in their way at the bar. But armed guard sounds like someone who guarded prisoners of war. And particularly after 1943, when increasing numbers of prisoners of war became available, early on Italians and then Germans, very seldom Japanese. The Japanese just simply fought till they were dead. So there just weren't many Japanese POWs, but it sounds like, and frankly, Denny, I'm just guessing, it sounds like he was assigned to keep an eye on the POWs. Does that seem right based on what you know about his service record?
Denny just replied. He said the armed guards were the Navy gunners on a merchant ship.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's entirely different. Yeah, the British called that the Wavy Navy. These were, before the war, it was illegal for merchant ships to have guns on board. International law. I mean, we're neutrals. But of course, that's before Germans started sinking them indiscriminately. So that after that, by 1942, they began putting 3-inch guns and eventually 6-inch guns on merchant ships. They usually put one in the bow, one in the stern. Well, of course, the crew on the merchant ships, they didn't know how to shoot a 6-inch gun. I mean, that's a pretty technical evolution. So these were Navy enlisted and occasionally warrant officers who were assigned the responsibility of being the gunnery crews on those merchant ships. And boy, I tell you, we were talking earlier about what's one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. Being on a German U-boat in 1943, check, but also being a gunner on a merchant ship in the transatlantic convoys, because you weren't in an armored turret. You were in an open air 6-inch gun bolted to the deck, taking on German, not only U-boats, but taking on German surface raiders like the Deutschland and some of the others that had 11-inch guns and could outrange you and just shoot you to pieces. So that's a pretty tough duty too. Thanks, Denny. I
I
appreciate
hope,
that.
yeah,
Thanks for the
I
tip.
hope that satisfies Denny, because like Denny was pretty persistent. I have one more, where did it go? I'm just going to close. It's not really a question, but I thought it sums up what a lot of us probably want to say. Thank you, thank you, thank you for doing what you do. We war history buffs need you and all research writers like you. So I concur. So thank you, Dr. Symonds, for all the time you've spent researching and writing and sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you to the 90 or so people who showed up tonight. I appreciate it. Difficult times for all of us, but better times ahead.
Great. I did put up a picture of some of your Dr. Symonds' most recent books, Lincoln and His Admirals, the Neptune, Battle of the Midway, and Decision at Sea. So, Craig, you might want to say anything particular about any of those?
The bestseller is the Battle of Midway. That has sold really well. I'm going to say partly perhaps because of the movie that came out. That got a little spike. The one that's not up there is the big fat one on World War II at Sea, which has all the battles from the Second World War from all of the navies. I had a lot of fun doing that one too. So,
Yep.
but thank you. I appreciate this.
We showed that one at the beginning.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
All right.
Just
Good
before
night,
you go,
everybody. Good night.
wait,
Wait.
just a moment.
Okay.
Just want to remind everybody that's still on the call about our virtual helmet committee. And we're accepting donations, and there is a matching grant of up to $100 for every dollar that is contributed to our cause. And finally, next month's meeting, as Terry announced earlier, is Thursday, March the 4th at 7 p.m. We apologize for any miscommunication we had this evening on our link. We'll try to do better in the future. Our speaker is David Barrett, and he's going to be talking about Reign of Ruin, 140 days to Hiroshima, and we hope to see you then.